Thank you, Amna, for that really generous introduction. I was not going to bring up the fact that it took a lot of arm twisting to get me to agree, mostly because it's the end of my semester as well, and I have a pile of grading that is waiting for me. But it was ultimately, I think, the offer of a free trip to London was too good to pass up. But seriously, I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thank you all for choosing to spend this wonderful summer evening or spring evening talking about really difficult stuff rather than being out enjoying yourself. So thank you for that. And of course, thanks to the Muslims Trust and Cultural Dialogue Project and the Center for Pakistan, Peter Mori and Amna Yaqeen, for bringing me over and giving me the chance to speak to you tonight. So I apologize for having to read my talk, but I think there's so many pieces to the puzzle that I was trying to bring together that I gave up the idea of extemporizing very early on. So just bear with me. I'll try and make it as engaging as I possibly can. So I want basically to talk today, as you might get a sense from my title, about the relationship between liberalism as a political tenet and as ideology and authoritarianism, and specifically about the nature of this relationship in our current historical conjuncture. So we are almost near the end of the 14th year of the global war on terror, which is often and more appropriately referred to as the global war of terror, both in the sense that terror is the logic that fuels it and gives it meaning, and because it has resulted in the visitation of terror on various populations around the world. And I use the term populations wisely because they really are imagined as populations and not as individual human beings. That the word terror and terrorist in the West is now almost exclusively associated with Muslims explains why this war on terror is only concerned with Muslims, whether at home or abroad. And I'm going to be speaking I'm going to be speaking largely from my location as an academic and activist in the US. So, but I'm sure the little that I get to follow of things that have been happening here, a lot of what I talk about in terms of the transformations of US society and state will resonate with you here. So I think it would be entirely appropriate to say that these 14 years have transformed the world in fundamental ways. In these 14 years, this war has spread geographically to more and more parts of the quote-unquote Muslim world, as well as in scope, infiltrating more and more aspects of social, cultural, and political life within North America and Europe, employing ever new techniques and technologies. It has also intensified both domestically, and by domestically I mean the US, as well as abroad in the so-called official theaters of war. From the perspective of the US and its NATO allies, this war has always had both domestic and international dimensions. And in both cases, the justification for extraordinary or unprecedented measures has been provided by a fear of the Muslim enemy. What is crucial to note is not only how deep this fear runs, but the fact that it is perhaps one of the few things over which there is consensus across the political spectrum in the US. There are differences, of course, in the way in which it is understood and articulated on the left versus the right, broadly speaking, but these differences are secondary, really, to the similarities. In fact, these different forms are the very source of the ideology's strength because it allows different people to pick and choose their Islamophobia much as they would their breakfast cereal. Just as the various choices in consumer items available under late capitalism, designed to appeal to a broad range of lifestyles, serves to mask the reality of corporate class power, the different varieties of Islamophobia that consumers can choose between based on their chosen lifestyle, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, bohemian, hipster, etc., mask the fact that they all collectively serve to bolster the same imperial interests and the project abroad and class interests domestically. Well, class and racial interests, really, domestically. And so while today there may be a consensus within the liberal mainstream on how to understand George W. Bush's feminist turn in the lead up to the attack on Afghanistan in October 2001, that is, as a cynical exploitation of Afghan women's very real plight for imperialist purposes, what we conveniently forget is just how much traction this had among progressives at that time. Amna, Amna has graciously consented to be my runner. Just one page down is fine. Oh, not the, yeah. I think from up there you could probably, or just to page down. Yeah, there we go. All right, so just as a reminder. Those who at that time called it for what it was constituted a very small minority and were excoriated by friends, colleagues, family members, and comrades for their cynicism and callousness. We also forget that the relationship between liberal feminism and the imperialist state at this point went beyond bolstering the neocons' ideological cover. The Feminist Majority Foundation, I don't know how many of you might be familiar with the Feminist Majority Foundation, but it's a foundation that owns Ms. Magazine. It's a very powerful liberal feminist foundation in the US, and they actually, they had been since the 1990s running this kind of political awareness campaign around what they call gender apartheid in Afghanistan under the Taliban. And so their project actually precedes the needs of the US state at this point in time, but they have, so what we had here was a confluence of these two interests coming together. The Feminist Majority Foundation actually worked very closely at the time with State Department officials. And lest we go patting ourselves on the back for being much wiser now, let us pause and think about how much traction this particular meme of the Muslim woman who needs saving from Muslim men and even Islam itself continues to have across the board. Today, the idea that Muslim women are uniquely and exceptionally oppressed and that Islam is the source of their oppression has become part of the unquestioned common sense about Islam, not just in the West, but in other parts of the world, including, crucially, in some parts of the Muslim world in the sense of not specific countries in the Muslim world, but within those countries, certain strata. And just as it has been and remains a key element in the ideological justification for the war on terror, such that the latter is often implicitly and often explicitly too understood as a war on behalf of Muslim women. If not primarily, then at least as a really decent perk. And so the war serves multiple purposes for the US, avenging 9/11, or in the case of the UK, 7/7, or whatever, protecting our way of life from the threat posed by illiberal Muslims, and of course, saving Muslim women. The latter seems by far the most noble and least problematic reason, helping to whitewash the increasingly obvious and explicit nature of the racism which underlies the support for the war. Needless to say, dissenting points of view, even or especially if they come from Muslim women themselves, cannot be allowed to disrupt this narrative, and so they are left out by a compliant media. For example, we can look at how RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, disappeared from the news once it distanced itself from the militarized feminism of the Feminist Majority Foundation and its new alliance with the US state. Just how important for the status quo the meme of the Muslim woman in need of saving is, and just how mainstream the idea of a militarized feminism as her savior have become, can be judged by the timing of this meme's invocation and circulation periodically within public consciousness. In August 2009, for example, Time magazine's cover featured a disfigured young Afghan woman with the caption, "What happens when we leave Afghanistan?" More recently, in May 2012, well, time passes. It's not recent anymore, but Amnesty USA ran a campaign openly supportive of the US NATO presence in Afghanistan just in time for the NATO summit in Chicago. Ads on city bus stops featured images of Afghan women in burqas along with the caption, "Human rights for women in Afghanistan. NATO, keep the progress going." Along this ad campaign, Amnesty conducted a shadow summit featuring former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright with promotional material rehashing Bush-era feminist justifications for the war in Afghanistan and claiming that the 11 years of war and occupation had improved conditions for Afghan women. This despite the clear evidence showing the negative effect of the US NATO occupation on the status of Afghan women, and in the face of consistent critiques of the occupation by Afghan women activists such as Malalai Joya. Exhorting the occupiers to keep the progress going, therefore, is tantamount to justifying in retrospect the feminist argument presented by Bush for the attack on Afghanistan. And so we then had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton under President Obama announce in her remarks at the UN Commission on the Status of Women in March 2010 that, and I quote, "President Obama and I believe that the subjugation of women is a threat to the national security of the United States." And even though, of course, she codes it as the subjugation of women in this generic sense, it's pretty clear that it's only the subjugation of some women that the United States sees as a threat to its national security, supposedly. She recently reiterated this commitment when she announced her bid for the presidency. Since the foreign policy interests of the US have now been formally linked to women and their liberation, it is hardly surprising then that we would see the mobilization of both hard and soft power to this end. And so we have Clinton meeting Pakistani women in a 2009 visit to Pakistan, which apparently did not go as well as she had planned. And in 2012, welcoming a contingent of Pakistani women working to counter extremism, members of a coalition called Amno Nisa in DC for a 15-minute meet and greet come photo op. Amno Nisa means peace and women, and it's kind of a really clunky title, which makes you wonder who came up with it. While touted as a homegrown initiative of local Pakistani women who focused on promoting peace, quote unquote, the coalition was the recipient of US State Department funding and training in concert with an organization called the United States Institute of Peace. The purpose of their trip to DC was to lobby US policymakers to include such pro-war women's initiatives in war on terror planning and to promote the idea that Pakistani women support the US war. In a laudatory piece on the visit, a seasoned Pakistani woman journalist declared that it showed the potential of soft power, which he then hopefully noted was or defined as a foreign policy concept based on the ability to attract and persuade rather than use force and coercion. That is, the use of the carrot rather than the stick, much preferable. During their trip to DC, our journalist noted with approval that the women met with representatives of the National Counterterrorism Center, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and the Department of State. None of this appears problematic to her. She is in fact delighted by how Clinton surprised the Pakistani contingent by asking to see them and further surprised them by suddenly stepping out of line, and I'm quoting from her, suddenly stepping out of line and talking to her Amno Nisa sisters, unquote. Rather than bring some healthy political realism to bear on this rather crass PR exercise, we were told incongruously that, and I quote from her again, Washington has acknowledged its foreign policy mistakes of the past with regards to Pakistan. President Obama and Secretary Clinton have apologized for them, and the US is actively supporting the democratic political process in Pakistan, unquote. The US acknowledgement, according to her, of women's role in fighting extremism would quote, I quote again, in the long run, roll back the tide of extremism, making the world a safer place. Soft power, woman power, unquote. The young and extremely courageous Malala Yousafzai is only the latest Muslim woman to be embraced by the US media, public, and state. Of course, the elevation of certain figures relies on the erasure of others. And so for every Malala that the West tries to co-opt, it must erase or silence a Malalai, as in Joya, who has never featured in any mainstream media outlet, and who in fact was denied a visa on her last trip to the US, and it was finally granted to her only after a lot of mobilization by activists. Or a Nabila, the 9-year-old girl from Waziristan, whose grandmother was killed by a drone strike just before Eid the year before, for whose testimony before Congress in 2013 on life under drones brought out all of 5 members of that venerable institution, 430 of them deciding that it wasn't worth their time. Interestingly, in the case of Malala Yousafzai, the erasure applies to aspects of her own politics, which are inconvenient to the requirements of the imperialist project. I'm referring, of course, to her professed socialist politics and her critique of drones, which she relayed to Obama during her recent White House visit. And of course, the fact that she also announced that she was basically going to send the money that she got as a prize for the Nobel to help people in the Gaza Strip. That also didn't get much coverage in the US press. Drones and Malala are connected in Pakistani liberal discourse in a far more pernicious way, however. Thank you. It's important to bear in mind that the last few things that I've been talking about have been really about the Obama administration. This is worthy of note because Obama's victory was underwritten in large part by the groundswell of anti-war sentiment which had built in the latter years of the Bush administration. And Obama, the constitutional lawyer, the community activist, the biracial, that is just black enough candidate, was in the popular imagination the antithesis of Bush and his neocon cabal. Obama's election was celebrated in the US as a moment of redemption by liberal America. And it is appropriate that it is under Obama that the contradictions of liberal America and liberalism as an ideology should become glaringly obvious. The relationship of liberalism to authoritarianism or regimes of illiberalism is not new. As Giorgio Agamben has argued, paced Carl Schmitt, the idea of the exception is built into liberal political theory. The British and to some extent the French colonial enterprises were, after all, liberal empires. The civilization that the civilizing mission aimed to transfer to the natives was defined by liberal norms. And that included this idea of elevating the status of women, native women. In the post-colonial period, or the period of neocolonialism, modernization theory, which underwrote the US-led development project, enshrined the role of the military in third world states as a preeminent agent of modernization, and Pakistan has a very particular history with this, and I shall return to this point later. So I just said that Obama's election in 2007 was underwritten in large part by popular anti-war sentiment. However, what subsequently became clear was that, at least as far as the liberal mainstream was concerned, the opposition was not to American imperialist aggression to court, but Bush's misadventure in Iraq. One of the things that the Iraq war had done was to rip the veil off the supposedly noble motivations for launching the global war on terror. Also, by that time, Bush was too crass and Republican to be palatable to American liberals. Candidate Obama's views on the global war on terror reflected this distinction between the good war in Afghanistan and the bad war in Iraq. Pakistani liberal and sometimes self-described leftist intellectuals have had a major role to play in strengthening the ideological justification for the global war on terror. Ahmed Rashid's book on the Taliban, for example, has been the holy grail for politicians and the public alike. But it is under Obama that their role has taken on even more importance. One reason for this is the expansion of the theater of war from Afghanistan into Pakistan as part of AFPAC, and the CIA's one secret drone war in Pakistan's so-called lawless tribal regions. Amna? Sorry, next one. So just in time for Obama's election, you had this Newsweek cover, of course. Pakistani liberal intellectuals perform an important ideological function when they, as Pakistanis, justify the US-NATO war in AFPAC, and of course the global war on terror more generally. Of course, they do so not necessarily for any personal benefit, and I want to emphasize that liberals, whether in the US or in Pakistan, are not all of a piece, and we can talk in the Q&A about the various motivations behind their support for the war and specifically Pakistan's own war on terror. But I'm interested just in seeing, for now, instead of going into motivations, just seeing what it is that they say and what their support amounts to, right? So, of course, they do so not necessarily for any personal benefit, but because they share in some cases, the racist, colonial, and Orientalist attitudes towards the people of Fatah and other victims of the global war on terror. So you had one prominent Pakistani liberal intellectual in, I think it was 2010, bemoaning the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and also defending the US's drone war in Pakistan. In a piece which first appeared on the Pakistani socialist website magazine Viewpoint, but was later republished in the Open Democracy blog, he draws an equivalence between the Americans' use of mechanized drones and the suicide bombers deployed by our extremists. In fact, he argues that there is no equivalence. Pakistani drones are far more numerous in number and far cheaper than American drones, and their trail far bloodier. He ends this particular piece, which is called Drones, Theirs and Ours, thus: in this grim situation, there is no guarantee of victory, even eventually. To prevent defeat, every effective weapon, economic, social, political, and military, must be pressed into service. The use of aerial drones, terrible though it is a necessary evil, unquote. It is clear from references to the outrage of American peace activists in this same piece which he calls Men and Women of Exceptionally Good Conscience, that this piece was necessitated by the emergence of anti-drone activism in the US. So this brings me to the second reason for the increasing importance of Pakistani pro-war voices, especially those that can claim a left provenance within the US, which I argue has to do with the re-emergence of a principled movement against the US's imperialist wars of aggression abroad and racist project at home. This movement, which ranges from teach-ins to acts of civil disobedience, such as those by anti-drone activists at drone bases in the US, to legal activism by prominent civil rights organizations against the targeting of Muslims. And that this is the result of years of hard work by anti-war activists of all stripes. And maybe again in the discussion time, if you're interested, I can talk to you about just how difficult it has been to get people involved in some of these, some of this activism, and the resistance that people have faced, myself included, from very well-meaning liberal and leftist quarters in the US. So this re-energized anti-war activism in the US has in turn seen the mobilization of a new front of leftist and erstwhile anti-war feminists within the US. They are joined by feminists from Muslim-majority countries such as Algeria and Pakistan. The principal task that the members of this constituency have set themselves is to undermine the critique put forth by leftist and liberal critics of Obama's war policies, and also specifically by Pakistani anti-war leftists. So, and again, we can talk, I'll talk a little bit about that here, but we can, if you are interested, talk about the specifics of what that looks like. The fact that these detractors are feminists with left-wing, anti-racist, and often anti-imperialist credentials matters greatly. Despite the existence of a very real gendered racial project at the heart of the war on terror, and the mainstream acceptance of the violence that it enables on Muslim men in particular and Muslim communities in general, since Muslim men do not exist in a vacuum, the members of this constituency, this left-wing constituency within the US, challenge what they see as the international human rights community's inordinate focus on Muslim men as victims. And you should read this against what I have just said about how difficult it actually has been in the US to get human rights organizations involved in issues pertaining to state attacks, for lack of a better word, on young Muslim men in the US. They contend that the well-meaning but misplaced focus by Western human rights advocates on the humanity of the others of the West has rendered the quote-unquote others invisible, that is Muslim women, thereby rendering them even more vulnerable. This focus on Muslim men as victims, they argue, constitutes a betrayal of Muslim women insofar as the idea of Muslim men as victims occludes their role as perpetrators of violence against Muslim women. I know that is a mouthful, but so let me repeat that again. So the idea is that focusing on the human rights violations against Muslim men that have taken place under the war on terror, because mostly it is Muslim men who, it is, I think, by and large, except for maybe Afia Siddiqui, Muslim men who have been rounded up and sent to sites such as Bagram and Guantanamo and other CIA black sites. So focusing on them as victims takes away from the fact that they are actually perpetrators of violence on their women. So it's all about how these anti-war leftists and anti-war feminists are naive and actually potentially dangerous insofar as their work contributes towards an increased violence against Muslim women who have been left vulnerable now. It sounds absurd, but really I'm not even paraphrasing what they say. And if you're interested, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, basically laying all this out, because this stuff had just started happening and these debates had just emerged. And so I felt it was necessary because, if they do nothing else, they really muddy the waters for us within left circles in the US, which is precisely the point. And so I sort of laid it out, and I don't have the time to do that here, but if you're interested, you can check that out. It's available online. Just to give you an example, in 2010, the Center for Constitutional Rights, an American civil rights nonprofit, decided to take up the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Awlaki, it must be recalled, was the first US citizen to be openly targeted for assassination for his political views by the US state. Letters of protest sent to CCR by Algerian feminists accused it of having betrayed Muslim women across the world by defending a known fundamentalist ideologue. CCR's argument that the targeting of al-Awlaki on the basis of an executive decision by the president, which bypassed all due process, represented a major assault on the constitutional rights of US citizens, fell on deaf ears. So CCR was not, specifically focused on defending al-Awlaki. They were concerned about the fact that now the US president had the executive power to assassinate any US citizen that he or she chose to without having to pass that by anyone. Which is, if you think about it, really, your fundamental right to life has just been taken away, and this is the thing that they were trying to fight. Instead, they were told that what they were doing was making Muslim women more vulnerable. This is the context within which the arguments and critiques of certain Pakistani liberal intellectuals who claim some sort of affinity with the left, broadly speaking, fit in. Sometimes these individuals have connections with American and specifically Indian American leftists and publish in leftist spaces, all of which means that their ideas circulate among left-wing academic and activist circles within the West and may be taken seriously by people who would not be open to such arguments were they coming from more obviously right-wing or even liberal hawkish quarters. And of late, much of the ire of such Pakistani liberal leftists has been aimed at Pakistani anti-war leftists, as I think I mentioned before. And I tried to fit some of the wonderfully rich stuff that I have in this talk, but I couldn't do it. So if you're so inclined, I can share it with you in the Q&A. The other major role that Pakistani liberal intellectuals have played over the past decade or so is to affirm every American stereotype about Pakistan, that it is schizophrenic, irrational, prone to conspiracy theories, and therefore inexplicably anti-American. Here are examples from the writings of a single prominent Pakistani liberal intellectual, and again, there are many, many examples, but I'm going to share some of them. And these are direct quotes. In the present anti-American climate, the manufacture of conspiracy theories has become Pakistani's single biggest industry. And of course, we all know that conspiracy theories abound in Pakistan. But as a sociologist, I have to always ask the question, why, right? And the answer to that question offered by such intellectuals really is that there's just something bizarre about Pakistanis, right? Primarily that they're schizophrenic. And the second quote is, Pakistan's collective psychosis is painful to behold, right? So this is the language in which these kinds of debates and discussions about Pakistan are conducted, right? So just to get back to the issue of conspiracy theories and why so many of them exist, as a wise American once said that it's only a conspiracy if you haven't been targeted, right? So the fact that conspiracies actually exist, that conspiracies are constantly at play, which is repeatedly shown even in the mainstream media once they come out, that there are all kinds of shady and shadowy backroom deals taking place between all kinds of agents within Pakistan, across Pakistan and the US, within the US. None of that seems to justify or explain the fact that might be why people are more prone to conspiracy theories in certain parts of the world or at certain points in time, right? And then this same intellectual in another piece referred to surveys that show that Pakistan is, and I quote, more anti-American than Iran or Cuba. In other places, the comparison drawn is to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Cuba, countries where, according to him, animosity against the US actually makes sense since they have actually been attacked by Washington, right? Which of course means that in the case of Pakistan, it doesn't make sense, right? I guess a drone war does not really constitute an attack by Washington unless the slippage here is that FATA is not really Pakistan, right? Hang on though, apparently drone strikes cannot explain this irrational anti-Americanism of the Pakistanis because, and this is a longish quote because it's just too rich for me to paraphrase. These are relatively, so drone strikes cannot explain this irrational anti-Americanism because these are relatively precise strikes on Al-Qaeda and Taliban targets in Waziristan, which have devastated the Islamist leadership while killing some civilians as well. Although the death of innocents is terrible and deserves condemnation, it is utterly insignificant compared to the carnage in Vietnam cities, which were carpet bombed by B-52s in the 1970s. Nevertheless, the anger in Pakistan leads to a ferocious, I don't know, I must have mistyped something. The anger in Pakistan is far greater than ever existed in Vietnam, right? I mean, which leads me to think that Vietnamese should be angrier at the US, but drones also cannot explain anti-Americanism in Pakistan, according to this gentleman, because it appears that some people in FATA support drones, and this is also an argument that has been circulated often. How is one to know, though, since the writer acknowledges that scientific survey of attitudes in FATA in today's dangerous circumstances is impossible, but yet he soldiers on, and I quote again, "Nevertheless, the impression one gets in talking to individuals is that tribal people with education generally favor drone strikes. This includes those who have lost relatives, but uneducated people who form the overwhelming majority hate them," right? So there you have it. In addition to supporting the various phases of the US's global war on terror in Pakistan, from the hard power of militarized drone attacks to the soft power illustrated by the Amno-Nisab project, Pakistani liberal intellectuals and civil society activists have repeatedly supported the Pakistani military's operations in FATA and the northern areas. The resounding consensus across civil society activists and organizations, including the Women's Action Forum, on the military's Operation Zarb-e-Azb last summer was followed by strong support for army action in the wake of the massacre of school children in Peshawar in December. The statement released by the self-described leaders of civil society, this is a direct quote from the statement, which is titled, "Together We Fight Terrorism in All Its Forms," begins by welcoming, and I quote, "the national resolve of all parliamentary parties conference not to differentiate between good and bad terrorists and eliminate every terrorist, and pledge of our Chief of Army Staff General Rahid Sharif not to let any terrorist go scot-free." In the list of demands, we find this one, number 9. "If the current extraordinary situation so requires, certain exceptions and temporary deviations can be allowed, such as awarding the death penalty in the most serious crimes, which are all acts of terrorism, followed by all counterterrorism authorities and personnel should be liable to public scrutiny at some appropriate parliamentary forum, and all their deviations and excesses should be judicially accounted for," conveniently after the fact. Never mind the fact that I can't remember the last time the counterterrorism authorities and the military were ever held to account in a parliamentary forum in Pakistan. And the last demand, curiously, is that all martyrs of armed forces and civilians should be honored with national gratitude. This gratitude towards the military and paramilitary apparatus in Pakistan is echoed in a recent op-ed in Dawn by prominent journalist Irfan Hussain. Titled "Action at Last," it begins, "I have opposed military intervention into politics." One immediately feels a but coming, and sure enough, the next sentence is, "However, given the awful governance and amoral expediency we have witnessed for years, I am happy to support the current drive to eliminate jihadist terrorists and political thugs who have blighted our lives." The army has widespread support for its anti-terrorism campaign. These are all quotes from that op-ed. "This attack has given General Sharif a virtual blank check to go after terrorists of all hues, and he is using it to good effect. Terrorists and criminals have caused havoc across the country for years without fear of retribution. A weakened state has failed in its primary function of protecting its citizens. Hence, the huge sense of relief the current operations in FATA and Karachi have given rise to. And the piece ends with, "This is going to be a long, hard war. But meanwhile, let us be grateful to our soldiers, pilots, and rangers for the wonderful job they are doing," unquote. Of course, such celebration and relief that the military has finally been given the freedom to deal with terrorists of all stripes, as if that's what it was waiting for, is bound to generate some cognitive dissonance, right? And sure enough, here it is. But in this hopeful scenario, a couple of doubts remain. Hafiz Saeed, the head of the Jamaat-ud-Dawa, roams free despite being accused of being behind many terrorist attacks, including the infamous Mumbai massacre. Zakiur Rahman Lakhvi, one of the men being tried for their role in the Mumbai attack, has been allowed bail by our courts. It's amazing that a seasoned journalist like Hussain is suddenly unable to connect the dots here. But no matter, such contradictions are easily taken care of by either blaming the politicians or rogue elements within the army. Any fig leaf that can cover the naked truth that it is the deep state itself which is responsible will do. This support for the military might, from liberals and left and people who identify sometimes as leftists, might seem exceptionally odd to someone familiar with the history of these civil society leaders and liberal journalists vis-a-vis military rule both under Ayub and Zia. From Zia onwards, however, the situation in Pakistan shifted in significant ways. With the decimation of the left under Zia, and then worldwide following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a particular anti-imperialist political imaginary and framework of analysis was thrown into the dustbin of history. This was particularly significant given the rise of neoliberalism in all its forms, economic, political, social, and cultural, at precisely this time. One aspect of this neoliberalism has been the NGOization of progressive politics, especially feminist politics, in Pakistan as elsewhere, which involved, among other things, a focus on abstract ideas of universal human rights and a move away from popular mobilization precisely at the time when the religious right was making inroads into the public sphere. The rise of violent religious extremism and ethno-nationalism alongside neoliberalism worldwide is also a pattern that many analysts have pointed to. So there's a connection between neoliberalism and the rise of violent religious extremism worldwide. And of course, Pakistan has a very specific story to tell there, which is connected to, as we all know, the Afghan War of the 1980s. Traumatized by the violence of the Zia regime and horrified at the rising tide of religious extremism in the 1990s, Pakistani progressives came to see the latter as the principal contradiction, fighting which by any means necessary became the paramount consideration. What this actually meant became apparent with Musharraf's coup against Nawaz Sharif in 1999, when the vast majority of civil society progressives voiced their support of the secular Musharraf and expressed relief at having been saved from Nawaz Sharif. The Nawaz Sharif government, which in addition to working on passing a Shariat bill in the National Parliament, had launched a campaign of harassment against human rights and women rights NGOs in the Punjab. Many of these prominent members of Pakistani civil society went on to join Musharraf's cabinet, and the Pakistani military became part of the liberal mainstream in Pakistan until a national level movement against Musharraf led by lawyers changed the political game. And then of course, now we're in a completely different space. Thus, the unconditional support for the global war on terror among Pakistani liberals, including 4 Pakistani military operations in tribal regions and in urban areas like Karachi by paramilitary rangers, is not unprecedented. Liberals in Pakistan have shown a predilection of late for authoritarianism as long as it is of the quote-unquote secular variety. And again, I've written in detail about this in my book about this transformation. However, it was not long before the perceived threat of an imminent Taliban takeover and a concern with women's rights once again resulted in liberals embracing the military as savior. This is following on from the lawyers' movement. I'm referring, of course, to the operation in Swat, liberal support for which was generated when a cell phone video showing the flogging of a Swati woman by the Taliban was circulated. This operation displaced over 2 million people, and reports of serious human rights abuses by intelligence agencies and the military soon began to appear in the media, but neither produced any soul-searching amongst supporters of the operation, nor a disavowal of the military as an agent of secularism. This despite the fact that the Pakistani military's relationship with the Taliban, however complex and contradictory it may be, is well documented and well known, even enshrined in a popular slogan, "Ye jo dehshatgardi hai, iske piche vardi hai," right? This terrorism, behind it is the uniform, meaning the army, right? Pakistani liberal support for US drone strikes has similarly remained strong even in the face of a shift in world public opinion against them and a recognition that they are far from surgical in their precision. This support comes from the same anxiety over Talibanization noted above, but also, as I said before, a deep-rooted and Orientalist ethno-racism against the people of the tribal areas who appear in liberal Pakistani discourse only as barbaric others. Within this discourse, all tribal men, especially those of North and South Waziristan, are assumed to be either actual or imminent militants and therefore legitimate military targets. This, as it happens, is exactly the same logic as that of the US state. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that the revelation that the US State Department considers all men of military age within regions targeted by drones to be militants, unless their innocence is posthumously proved, did not excite much comment within the Pakistani liberal universe and certainly did not result in any condemnation of what is effectively collective punishment. But then collective punishment has been the lot of the people of FATA from the time of British colonialism to today. The idea that FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, are a lawless frontier crawling with these militants, and that this has something to do with the fact that they are tribal and Pashtun, obviously echoes media tropes in the West and enables the kind of dehumanization necessary for the drone war and military operations of the sort that we continuously see today. And if we need reminders of this dehumanization, let's consider for a moment terms such as bug splat, which drone operators in the US use, and the very strategy of double tapping. Anyone not know what double tapping means? It's hitting the same area twice, and the reason for that is that you wait, obviously, between the two taps because you wait for people to come to help the people who have been attacked, and then you attack the second time. And you call it double tapping, so, you know. And let's think about the fact that the only time that the Obama administration claims that only militants are killed by drone strikes because US intelligence is that good has been questioned by liberals in the US has been in the aftermath of the recent death of 2 white Westerners in a drone strike. The fairly consistent liberal support in Pakistan for the military, with occasional hiccups such as the lawyers' movement, has helped shore up a monstrous and metastasizing neoliberal national security state. Like its American counterpart, it is a deep state that generates violence and deprivation and thrives on secrecy, except that in the case of the Pakistani military, the violence is directed in large part to its own citizens. I mean, it is in the US too, but in different ways. Like in the US, this liberal support relies on the racialization of internal others. Muslims, in the case of the US, and in Pakistan, the Pashtun broadly speaking, and the people of FATA in particular, who are predisposed by their culture and religion to be extremists, as evidenced by their views on Islam and women. And here I just want again to note that the presence of large numbers of extremists in Punjab does not generate the same sort of racialized panic about the entire Punjabi population, right? The terror that the Pakistani military has itself been visiting, not just in FATA, but in Balochistan and the northern areas, particularly Gilgit-Baltistan, which nobody really talks about, is either never mentioned or remains in the realm of the unsaid. Until the brave activists of the Voice for Baloch Missing Persons movement brought the issue of torture and kidnappings by the military and intelligence agencies into the national mainstream last year, human rights groups in Pakistan were largely silent on the issue. And just how important this issue is, and for the issue is as a moral issue, and how important it is for the deep state that the silence on Balochistan be maintained, was brought home to us all too clearly through the assassination of Sabeen Mahmood recently. Over in the US, the result of a political consensus on the global war on terror secured by a democratic president is a neoliberal national security state of massive proportions as well, which similarly thrives on secrecy and surveillance, and a society which has allowed those in power to use fear of a racialized other or of Islamic terrorism to fundamentally transform the state and its relationship to its citizens. A society where people have effectively traded the promise of security for almost every right they have as citizens of a liberal state. And the irony, of course, is that this has been done in the name of liberal values. To describe it as Orwellian would be an understatement. some of these contradictions within liberal discourse in the US came out into the open during the confirmation hearings of John Brennan as the next CIA director. When questioned about the fact that they were not critical of policies undertaken by Obama, which would have had them up in arms had Bush been the one to propose them, liberal pundits in the US across the board agreed. But they argued this was not really a double standard because they trusted Obama. And this is pretty much a direct quote, that this was a constant sort of argument that Obama could be trusted with these extraordinary powers, which Bush would never have been trusted with, as if individuals, as if issues of rights can be placed, at the behest of specific individuals with no accountability, right? And of course, nobody thinks about the fact that even if they have this implicit trust in Obama, he's not going to be around forever, right? But these policies and laws and executive orders will. So what the liberal supporters of the global war on terror in the US and Pakistan fail to understand is that the deep state is by definition not a responsible institution open to democratic accountability, one that will use the power granted to it to fight terrorism wisely. In the long run, it is not only the terrorists and dehumanized others of liberal discourse that will suffer the consequences of trusting the military to do the right thing. There is definitely a war going on in Pakistan, a war that promises to be long and brutal and in which there are no easy choices. But this war is not between the forces of secularism and religious extremism, but between the people of the region and the many anti-people forces at work there, which includes both the religious extremists and the Pakistani military. Thank you.